Hello, and welcome to Inside Trackers Connecting Through Science. I am Dietitian Diana. I'm a dietitian at Inside Tracker, and today I will be interviewing our very own lead nutrition scientist, Ashley Reaver. Welcome, Ashley.
Hello. Hi, Diana.
Hi, so want to just introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. So I am a dietitian at Inside Tracker. I've been with the company for over 5.5 years now. And yeah, I'm excited to dive in deeper. I'm a sports dietitian and excited to explain this iron group.
Awesome. Yes. So today we're going to be talking all about iron. It's something that we test for at Inside Tracker, and we got a ton of questions about this group because it does happen to be either high or low in a lot of our users. So it's definitely an important topic to address. And so we have a bunch of questions. I'm going to be asking you, Ashley. So I'm really excited to kind of just dive into this and get started.
Awesome.
All right. So my first question to you is just overall, what is iron and why is it so important? Why is this a biomarker that we really should be paying attention to?
So iron, I think the main component that most people are used to hearing about iron is that it's essential for us to be able to transport oxygen throughout the body, but it also has plenty of different functions. A little known one is that it's also essential for us to be able to turn carbohydrates and fat, and if necessary, protein into energy that our cells can use. So both of those components, along with a slew of other factors that iron is responsible for in the body, are why it is so important. And if iron is low, why fatigue is something that many people experience. Not only are they not able to transport oxygen efficiently throughout the body, but then they're also not able to produce energy that the cells can use efficiently either.
So interesting. Okay, so clearly iron is very important. It's one of the essential minerals we must obtain through our diet. And so at Inside Tracker, we do test for a few different iron markers. Can you go into detail and talk a little bit about the differences between some of those iron markers? Because I know this can be a little confusing for some people.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also confusing for the science team. The iron group is by far our most complicated group that we provide an analysis on. So there are 8 different markers, maybe 9 different markers in our iron group. And there's kind of 2 splits into how you can think about what those markers look at. So the first group would be markers that are looking at your red blood cells. And those are ones that we get from a CBC, which is a complete blood count, which most physicians also provide in a yearly physical. And those RBC markers, your red blood cell markers, are really indicating if there's a uniform size, if there are enough red blood cells. They look at the components within that red blood cell. And that really is to give some information about if there's some sort of structural issue with the red blood cell that would in some way prohibit oxygen from being transported efficiently throughout the body. The other half of the red blood cell, or excuse me, of the iron group is really looking at iron. So how much iron your body has, if it is high or low, if it's being stored appropriately, being transported. So it's important if there's an issue primarily in ferritin, which is where we like to look first as kind of a first clue of whether or not your iron metabolism is working properly. If there's an issue there, then the other markers are really helpful to go deeper into and figure out exactly what's causing that issue with your body being able to absorb, store, and utilize iron.
Okay, gotcha. So the difference, so when someone is trying to figure out their iron status, what would you say is the best marker to really pay attention to? Is it blood iron? Is it ferritin? Is it the red blood cell count that you just said?
Yep. So we start with ferritin, and ferritin is really, it's a protein in your body that your body produces in response to the amount of iron that you take in. So if you aren't eating a lot of iron, you're not going to have a high level of ferritin. If you're increasing your amount of iron, then your ferritin level is also going to increase. So before looking at downstream things that could happen, like affecting the shape or the size of your red blood cells, looking at ferritin first is a good indication of whether or not your body is able to absorb enough iron, and have enough iron to carry out all of those many, many functions that iron does in the body.
Okay, great. So if you are worried about your iron, you should start with your ferritin to see what the status is there first. Okay, that's great. It's good to know because I know we do have a lot of users who do experience pretty low ferritin levels. So is there a certain population that does face a greater risk of having low ferritin or low iron in general? Can you touch upon that?
Absolutely. So the number one group that's going to experience lower levels of ferritin is premenopausal females that are active. In particular, if they are vegan or vegetarians, that's also going to increase the risk of having lower levels of ferritin. And that's twofold, really. Primarily, premenopausal females are losing blood every month. And that drastically increases the iron demands that the body has. So premenopausal females require about 10 milligrams more of iron per day than males do, which is a huge increase in itself. Add on top of that, if they're active, then there is some loss of blood that can happen in the friction of endurance activities. Nothing that you would really notice, but some internal bleeding that can cause blood loss, as well as when you are striking the ground, your heel strike, any red blood cells passing underneath your foot at the point of contact are susceptible to rupture, which means that your body is going to need to recycle those and utilize more iron in order to replace those red blood cells. Vegan and vegetarians, while it is certainly not impossible to get enough iron in your diet, it is a bit more difficult. There's two different forms of diet or of iron that you can find in the diet. The first one would be heme iron. That's typically what you're going to find in red meats, shellfish, any animal type protein that would provide iron. The other type, non-heme iron, is the type of iron that you get from plants. And that non-heme iron, before it can be absorbed in the body, has to be converted into the heme form. So that's a difficulty in itself, is just that it has to go through an extra process for absorption. Also, the types of plants that provide non-heme iron are also pretty high in compounds that bind to iron and make it impossible for us basically to absorb it. So in particular, phytic acid that you find in legumes, which are a great source of iron, but a lot of that iron is unavailable to us, as well as spinach, which is really high in oxalic acid, which is another compound that binds things. So coupling all of those things together, premenopausal active females that are vegan or vegetarians are really the number one group. But an iron deficiency is the number one micronutrient deficiency in the US, regardless of diet and level of physical activity.
Very interesting. So what would you recommend for vegans and vegetarians in particular who can't get their iron from those heme sources of iron? Where would you recommend they get their iron from?
So it can be found in some other plants. So ideally in plants that aren't high in that phytic acid, which is most high in beans, as well as wheat products, which beans are probably the primary source that most vegans or vegetarians depend on for their iron. So you can combine vegetarian sources of iron with vitamin C. So citrus is a great example that can be somewhat helpful in converting that non-heme into heme iron that our body can absorb. Spinach is another one that unfortunately most people point to. I blame Popeye cartoons from a long time ago. While it is a great source of iron, we can only actually absorb about 5% of it. So starting off, removing those two thoughts of being the best sources of iron in the diet and focusing on other things like hemp seeds, pumpkin seeds. Certainly other types of greens also have iron in them. And looking towards some foods that are fortified. So a lot of fortified cereals will have iron in them. And that form of iron is fortified in that heme form, the form that is easier for our body to absorb. Eventually, if trying to get iron through your diet is not enough to really move the needle, then it may be worth looking at taking a supplement if your ferritin levels are low enough. Where you are feeling fatigue and issues with executing your workouts as you would like. Also, just if your performance is really going to be dependent on your body actively transporting oxygen as efficiently as possible, in particular in those endurance type of activities, then a supplement may be worth considering.
Awesome. So two things I want to mention. One, I did hear that if you are a vegetarian or vegan, you can actually sprout your beans and really take time soaking them, and that can help break down some of those phytates, that phytic acid, and help more with that absorption. So that's something they could do as well. And as a premenopausal active female who eats mainly plant-based, it's something I've really struggled with. My iron levels, I've noticed, every time I get my blood tested with Insight Tracker, it's something I'm always working on because I see that those levels are pretty low. And if it's something I'm not consciously working towards and trying to improve, then they will go deficient. And so something I've done personally, other than that sprouting, is I actually use an iron casket skillet too. And because of the iron there, that has helped me absorb a little bit more iron and to get a little bit more iron in my diet. And sounds a little crazy to some people, thinking that an iron cast skillet can help with your iron levels. Is that safe? But yes, it is completely safe, and it's something that you can do to help maintain healthy iron levels as well. And that's, again, if you do struggle with iron. But I actually went this morning to go get my blood test done. And one of the main reasons I did go get tested was because I do feel, I haven't been tested in a while, and I do feel that my iron levels are on that lower side because I haven't been as diligent. So it is really important, if you do fall into that category of being a premenopausal active woman, especially if you add on top of that vegetarian vegan diet, it is something you really do want to focus on, because especially if you are an athlete, it can really affect your performance, and really want to avoid that. And I think, you have worked with a bunch of athletes who have been pretty shocked after testing with Insight Tracker, right? To see how low their ferritin levels were, but then it also made them realize why they were feeling so fatigued and why they were having so many symptoms. But I'll let you touch upon that. Tell me about your experience working with some of those athletes.
Yeah, honestly, some people, when they get their blood results back, and both you and I do results reviews with our customers, and honestly, I'm surprised that some people are able to walk around. So when they tell me they have to take a nap every day at 3 p.m., I'm honestly shocked they've made it past 11 because of how low their ferritin levels are. And I'll say too, ferritin isn't something that's included in a routine blood test. So unless your ferritin level is so drastically low that you also are having low hemoglobin levels, or it's impacting your red blood cell formation, most physicians aren't going to note if you have a very low store of iron in your body. So I love Insight Tracker's test just because, for many reasons, but for iron in particular, getting your ferritin tested is something that's included in the plans. It's not something that you have to beg your doctor to add onto your test to assess. And I would say too, for Insight Tracker, we have optimal zones, which we haven't necessarily touched on yet, but your optimal zone is going to be based on your gender, your activity level, your ethnicity. A lot of things can go into that, and particularly for your ferritin levels, our optimal groups are gender specific, and they're dependent on the type of activity that you do. And our optimal zone is a lot higher than where your doctor or just general labs would cut off as being normal.
Mm-hmm.
And that normal is important to note that having a ferritin level of 10 might be okay for someone that never exercises, that rarely gets off the couch, someone that's 80 years old. That isn't necessarily the right level for you to be able to perform and feel your best. So our optimal zone for ferritin is actually quite a bit higher, because higher levels of ferritin have been associated with feeling much better. And that's because, again, your body has enough of the nutrients to be able to effectively transport oxygen throughout your body, and to be able to really effectively utilize carbs, protein, and fat, and alcohol in the body in order to transfer that into a form of energy that your cells can utilize. So it's really night and day. A lot of people ask how quickly they can feel better by taking a ferritin supplement, or excuse me, an iron supplement, if that is what's appropriate for them. Honestly, for some people, it can be as quick as a month that you may feel a lot better. Others, it's going to take a long time. How our body really responds to absorbing most minerals, but in particular iron, is that based on the body's need for iron, you're going to be able to absorb a lot more of it. So if you have very low levels of ferritin, your body's going to be absorbing a lot more of iron from your GI tract. If you have higher levels of ferritin, your body's going to put resources elsewhere and not focus on pulling more of that iron out of your diet. So if you have super low levels and you do start making some changes, since your body's absorbing a lot of that iron right away, then you could feel differences in just general energy, not even in talking about performance, but being able to make it past 3 p.m. without requiring a nap is something that you can achieve once you know what the problem is and once you know how to fix it.
Definitely. Completely agree. And it's a shame that ferritin isn't routinely checked, especially with such a prevalent deficiency, that's too bad. But you can always get your ferritin tested at Inside Tracker, like Ashley said, along with a lot of other great markers. So let's flip this on the head. So have you experienced anyone with really high ferritin levels? If so, what usually causes this, and what are recommendations on how to bring this back to optimal levels?
Yeah. So again, iron group's super complicated, both high and low. I realize I'm being long-winded. I should probably cut these a little bit. But there's a couple reasons that you could have high iron. One is if you have a genetic predisposition for hemochromatosis, or you have one or two parents that you've inherited a gene from that. And this is actually something that I think I really nerd out about working at Inside Tracker, is that we've helped so many people identify that they have one of, like, maybe that they inherited one SNP for hemochromatosis because their ferritin levels are off the chart and they've never eaten any type of meat. That doesn't show up in their other markers, in their other iron group markers. And so that's one reason. If you have chronically, like, very elevated levels of ferritin and you aren't a chronic red meat eater, there's no real explanation as to why you have so much iron available in your body. That could be one indication for it. And again, I just love it. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. And so if someone did have really high ferritin, didn't eat a lot of meat, and wanted to check if they did have hemochromatosis, what is the next step in that? Like, how would they determine?
Yeah, so we at Inside Tracker have a DNA test now. Before we had that, though, a lot of people, that would be inspiration for them to go and try out another one of the DNA testing services to see. And that really inspired them to do it, that one marker. And then they found out that they had inherited something like that, and then went back and had a conversation with their family, and other family members were also pretty high in their ferritin levels, which is, I think, just super cool how that is inspiring you to continue on a health journey. Another reason that ferritin could be high, it is possible to have high ferritin levels if you consume a very large amount of iron. It's pretty difficult for the body to get there just from eating, let's say, a lot of red meat, because our body is super smart in that it can basically drastically reduce the amount of iron that can be absorbed in the GI tract if we have enough in our diet. If you're taking a supplement and you do not need one, though, that is definitely something that can push your ferritin level higher, because in supplement form, you are getting a very high dose of iron at once that is in the form your body is able to absorb most effectively. And that can just kind of brush by all of those protective mechanisms in the GI tract that would otherwise slow that down. So checking to make sure if you're taking a multivitamin, if you're a man or a postmenopausal woman, there is very little need that you would require, or probably very little likelihood that you have a need for a ferritin in a supplement. So definitely check that out. Also, some foods, again, are fortified with iron. So checking to see the foods that you eat most consistently, if they have iron in them, finishing the box of whatever that is and maybe not replacing it. And then the third thing that could cause high iron is if you have, or high ferritin levels, if you have inflammation. And this is another cool mechanism that our body has that's protective. We test hsCRP and white blood cells, both white blood cell count, but the 5 different types of white blood cells as well. And if you have a high level of inflammation, that's a good indication that your body potentially is trying to protect you from something. And one of those ways that our body is protective is it pulls iron out of our bloodstream. So you'll see your serum iron level drop, as well as your transferrin saturation, which is really the protein that shuttles iron around the body. And it puts those with ferritin, which is now in this kind of storage form, that if there is some sort of invader, then they're not able to access that ferritin or that iron stored with ferritin, which is going to impede their ability to grow and thrive and proliferate in your body, because that invader is also going to need iron to be able to do that. So if you have high levels of hsCRP or high white blood cells, and you also see a really big increase in your ferritin level, that could be falsely high just because your body's going through this protective mechanism. So all of those things to say, ways that you can lower your ferritin level if you're inflamed for some reason, if your body has mounted an inflammatory response, figuring out why that's high and trying to bring it down. But the other two, there's really no way to get iron out of your body other than losing blood. So if you have very high levels of iron, donating blood is actually an amazing way that you can bring those iron levels down. And we have some great blogs on one of our employees. He was testing and noticed his ferritin level was high, realized he had one of the genes for hemochromatosis, or inherited one of them from one of his parents, and repeatedly was using InsideTracker to measure his ferritin levels and using that as an indicator for when it was time for him to go and give blood. Bloodletting is what that would have been called a long time ago if you weren't donating, but now you can donate to a really great cause and help somebody out that may need a blood transfusion.
Wow, that's fascinating. Fun fact, I actually can't donate blood. I'm not allowed to, so I'm happy I don't have that gene. I lived in London during mad cow disease era. So because of that, I'm not allowed to donate blood. So I'm very grateful that I do not have that gene.
Well, you could just like cut yourself and bleed out then and hope it heals. That would also do the same thing. Not recommended.
Oh, wow. But yeah, I feel like when I do tell people that, that is an effective way of bringing down their ferritin levels to just donate blood, it's always like, oh yeah. I mean, it's shocking, but then it makes so much sense,
Yeah, exactly. Because your body's going to have to replenish the red blood cells that you just donated. It needs iron to do that. It needs iron to make hemoglobin in your red blood cells. So that is basically most of the iron in our body is tied up in red blood cells. So when you're releasing a lot of those red blood cells, then your body's going to have to use a lot of iron to replace them. So it's an effective way and also a great way to be helpful.
Yeah. And something also about heme iron that I think we should touch upon, which there have been some studies showing that excess heme iron intake. So if you do eat a ton of meat, a lot of red meat and processed rare meat, you're probably going to be intaking a lot of heme iron. And there have been some studies that show that a lot of heme iron can also be detrimental to your health, especially when it comes to insulin resistance. It can increase your risk of insulin resistance, which is an underlying cause for a lot of other chronic conditions. Have you seen any of those studies? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, so really all minerals, but iron in particular, because many people overeat iron in the form of red meat in the US. If you have too much of any mineral in your body, it can start to deposit itself in your soft tissues. So that is your muscles, can be your joints. It can also be your organs, like your brain and your heart, or in the case of diabetes, could certainly also be your pancreas. And yeah, I would say that can certainly happen. Get like knowing where your ferritin level is and seeing if that can be associated with higher levels of HbA1c or blood glucose. perhaps there are studies on those now that you can find. But certainly that's why we also have recommendations to reduce your red meat intake if you want to bring your glucose levels and your HbA1c levels back down.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think I'm all out of questions. I think you really covered everything I would want to know, and I think a lot of our users would want to know about iron. Any last parting words of wisdom that you would like to talk about when it comes to iron?
Yeah, I would say if your iron levels are low, it just takes consistent effort. You're not alone, and it's just going to take time to move it. Yeah. If you are on a vegan or vegetarian diet, it absolutely does not mean that you are doomed to low ferritin levels. It just does take a bit more effort. Even if you're not, like most females, even though we have much higher needs for iron, aren't eating the most red meat. So it's definitely a common struggle that you are not dealing with alone. And we've got a lot of great recommendations to help you increase that level on the site.
Yeah, and if you don't want to eat red meat, you can always focus on shellfish if you aren't vegetarian or vegan.
Shellfish is the best source of iron.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ashley. This was really, really informative. You clearly know so much about iron, so I'm so happy I was able to interview you. But yeah, thank you everyone for watching, and we will catch you next week in our next Connecting Through Science.